In this moment of profound civilizational confusion, when Americans find themselves politically adrift and spiritually disconnected from their founding principles, we face what I have termed the most dangerous form of forgetting, political amnesia. This is not merely a loss of historical facts or constitutional knowledge, but a forgetting of the fundamental experiences that make authentic political order possible. Watch a contemporary political debate, observe the shallow rhetoric of our leaders, witness the ideological fervor that has replaced genuine philosophical inquiry, and you will see the symptoms of a consciousness that has lost touch with the deepest sources of political wisdom. We live in an age of political amnesia so complete that we have forgotten we have forgotten. But there exists a path of recovery, what the Greeks called anamnesis, the philosophical recollection of forgotten truths. Through this contemplative discipline, consciousness can recover those originating experiences of order that our founders knew, that Lincoln embodied, and that remain available to any soul willing to undertake the difficult journey of genuine self-examination. The question is not whether America can be saved through electoral politics or policy reforms, but whether Americans can recover the consciousness that makes authentic political life possible. Chapter 1: The Nature of Political Amnesia. When I speak of political amnesia, I do not mean simply the forgetting of historical events or constitutional provisions, though such forgetting is symptomatic of the deeper problem. Political amnesia is the loss of consciousness regarding those fundamental experiences that generate authentic political order. It is the forgetting of what it means to participate in a reality that transcends immediate material interests and ideological constructions. Consider the founding of the American Republic. The men who gathered in Philadelphia possessed what we might call anamnetic consciousness. They could recall, through philosophical and spiritual discipline, the experiences of justice, liberty, and divine order that Plato had explored, that Aristotle had systematized, that centuries of Christian thought had deepened. When Jefferson wrote of self-evident truths and inalienable rights, he was not inventing new concepts but participating in an act of anamnesis, recovering eternal experiences of human dignity and transcendent obligation. This anamnetic consciousness allowed the founders to create institutions that participated in transcendent order rather than merely expressing temporal power. The separation of powers reflected their understanding that no human authority could claim absolute sovereignty. The Bill of Rights acknowledged that human dignity derives from sources beyond governmental grant. The entire constitutional structure embodied their recovery of classical insights about the proper ordering of political life. But what happens when a civilization loses this anamnetic capacity? When consciousness becomes so absorbed in immediate material concerns, technological innovations, and ideological obsessions that it can no longer recall the transcendent experiences that ground authentic order. We witness precisely what afflicts contemporary America: political discourse reduced to power struggles, constitutional interpretation divorced from founding principles, and civic life degraded to the manipulation of mass opinion. The symptoms of political amnesia manifest everywhere. Politicians speak of rights without understanding their transcendent foundation. Citizens demand benefits without grasping their obligations to the common good. Intellectuals construct ideological systems that systematically exclude the very experiences of transcendence that make rational political discourse possible. We have forgotten not just what our founders believed, but how they arrived at their beliefs through disciplined participation in the great conversation of Western civilization. This forgetting creates a peculiar form of spiritual poverty. Contemporary Americans possess unprecedented material prosperity and technological capability, yet they experience profound meaninglessness in their political life. They sense that something essential has been lost, but lacking anamnetic consciousness, they cannot identify what needs to be recovered. They substitute activism for contemplation, ideology for philosophy, and technique for wisdom. The danger of political amnesia extends beyond mere cultural decline. When consciousness loses touch with transcendent order, It becomes susceptible to what I have identified as Gnostic manipulation, the promise of creating perfect order through human action alone. Ideological movements exploit this amnesia, offering secular salvation to souls that have forgotten their genuine orientation toward transcendent reality. Chapter 2: The Gnostic Exploitation of Amnesia. Political amnesia creates a vacuum that ideological movements inevitably rush to fill. When consciousness loses its connection to transcendent order through anamnetic discipline, it becomes vulnerable to what I call Gnostic politics, the promise of creating perfect human order through the application of special knowledge and revolutionary action. The Gnostic structure of modern political movements reveals itself most clearly in their treatment of memory and tradition. Rather than engaging in genuine anamnesis, the recovery of permanent insights about human order, these movements promote a selective amnesia that serves their revolutionary purposes. They encourage forgetting of transcendent foundations while promoting detailed memory of historical grievances and social inequities. Observe how contemporary progressive movements operate. They demand the forgetting of America's founding principles as products of dead white males, while insisting on obsessive memory of every historical injustice. They promote amnesia regarding the transcendent sources of human dignity, while cultivating detailed awareness of group identities and power relationships. This selective memory serves the Gnostic purpose of delegitimizing existing order while creating emotional energy for revolutionary transformation. Conservative movements often fall into their own forms of Gnostic amnesia. They may remember constitutional forms while forgetting the contemplative discipline that made those forms meaningful. They celebrate founding documents while losing touch with the philosophical and spiritual experiences that animated their creation. This produces a hollow traditionalism that cannot effectively resist progressive Gnosticism because it lacks genuine anamnetic depth. The Gnostic exploitation of amnesia operates through what we might call the immanentization of memory itself. Instead of anamnesis as participation in eternal truth, memory becomes a weapon in temporal power struggles. Historical events are not contemplated for their revelation of permanent aspects of human nature and divine order, but manipulated to support particular political programs. This process creates what I observe as ideological pseudo-anamnesis, movements that claim to recover forgotten truths while actually promoting sophisticated forms of forgetting. Black Lives Matter claims to recover forgotten experiences of racial injustice, but systematically promotes amnesia regarding transcendent foundations of human dignity. The Make America Great Again movement claims to recover forgotten American values, but often promotes amnesia regarding the contemplative disciplines that made those values authentic expressions of transcendent order. The danger in both cases lies not in their attention to real problems. Racial injustice and cultural decline are genuine concerns, but in their Gnostic conviction that perfect solutions can be achieved through political action alone. They promote amnesia regarding the permanently tragic dimension of human existence and the necessity of spiritual discipline for authentic political improvement. When consciousness operates under Gnostic amnesia, it loses the capacity for what I call existential resistance, the ability to maintain spiritual independence from ideological manipulation. Citizens become susceptible to mass movements that promise to solve through political means problems that require spiritual transformation. They forget that authentic political order emerges from the ordering of individual souls in relation to transcendent reality. The recovery of genuine political consciousness requires recognizing how Gnostic movements exploit amnesia and developing the anamnetic disciplines necessary for spiritual resistance. Chapter 3: The Contemplative Discipline of Anamnesis. True anamnesis is not mere intellectual memory but a contemplative discipline through which consciousness recovers its participation in transcendent reality. This discipline forms the foundation of all authentic political wisdom, yet it remains almost entirely absent from contemporary American education and public discourse. The Platonic understanding of anamnesis, which profoundly influenced both classical and Christian civilization, reveals that genuine knowledge emerges not from external instruction but from the soul's recovery of its inherent orientation toward transcendent truth. When Socrates demonstrates that the slave boy already knows geometric principles, he illustrates how consciousness participates in eternal realities that transcend temporal experience. For political life, this means that authentic order cannot be imposed through external force or clever institutional design, but must emerge from the recovery of those experiences of justice, wisdom, and divine relationship that constitute the soul's proper orientation. The American founders understood this principle when they insisted that republican government required virtuous citizens, citizens whose consciousness participated in transcendent order. Consider your own experience of genuine political insight. When have you felt most clearly the difference between authentic statesmanship and mere political manipulation? When have you recognized the distinction between genuine justice and ideological righteousness? Such moments typically occur not through external argument but through what we might call anamnetic illumination, the recovery of experiences that reveal permanent aspects of political reality. This contemplative dimension of political consciousness has been systematically excluded from modern education. Students learn constitutional law without developing the spiritual discipline necessary to understand why constitutional limits matter. They study democratic theory without cultivating the contemplative capacity that enables authentic participation in political community. They memorize historical facts without developing the anamnetic consciousness that allows genuine learning from historical experience. The discipline of anamnesis requires what I call existential honesty, the willingness to examine one's own consciousness without the protective barriers of ideology or conventional opinion. This proves particularly difficult in our current environment, where political identity has become so central to personal identity that questioning one's political beliefs feels like questioning one's existence. Yet authentic anamnesis demands precisely this willingness to let go of constructed identities in order to recover genuine experiences of transcendent order. This does not mean abandoning all political commitments, but rather grounding those commitments in contemplative discipline rather than ideological certainty. The practice begins with what classical philosophy called the care of the soul, attention to the quality of one's own consciousness and its relationship to truth. This includes examination of how political emotions arise and subside, how ideological thinking operates, and how genuine insights differ from mere opinion. Through such examination, consciousness gradually recovers its capacity for anamnetic participation in transcendent reality. This contemplative discipline proves essential for authentic political participation because it provides the spiritual foundation necessary for resistance to ideological manipulation and the development of genuine political wisdom. Chapter 4: Historical Patterns of Recovery and Decline. The history of Western civilization reveals recurring cycles of anamnetic recovery and decline, offering crucial insights for understanding our current predicament and possibilities for renewal. These patterns demonstrate that political consciousness can indeed recover from even profound amnesia, but only through the disciplined work of individuals willing to undertake genuine philosophical and spiritual inquiry. The Renaissance represents perhaps the most dramatic example of anamnetic recovery in Western history. After centuries of what we might call scholastic amnesia, the forgetting of direct philosophical inquiry in favor of systematic commentary on established authorities, figures like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola recovered the contemplative disciplines of Platonic philosophy. This recovery of anamnetic consciousness created the intellectual foundation for both the artistic achievements of the Renaissance and the eventual emergence of modern constitutional government. Similarly, the American founding represented an extraordinary moment of anamnetic recovery. Men like Jefferson, Madison, and Adams had cultivated through extensive reading and contemplation a deep familiarity with classical political wisdom. They could recall, through disciplined study and reflection, the experiences of political order that Aristotle had analyzed, that Cicero had embodied, and that centuries of Christian thought had developed. This anamnetic consciousness enabled them to create institutions that participated in transcendent order rather than merely expressing temporal power. Yet even these moments of recovery contained the seeds of subsequent decline. The Renaissance recovery of classical wisdom became corrupted by Gnostic movements that promised perfect human order through the application of recovered knowledge. The scientific revolution, despite its genuine achievements, promoted forms of consciousness that systematically excluded the very experiences of transcendence that make anamnetic recovery possible. The American founding similarly contained tensions that would eventually produce our current crisis. The founders' emphasis on individual rights, while grounded in their anamnetic understanding of human dignity, proved vulnerable to individualistic interpretations that forgot the transcendent foundation of those rights. Their confidence in popular government, while based on their understanding of human rationality, proved vulnerable to democratic manipulations that exploited rather than cultivated citizen consciousness. The pattern reveals a crucial insight. Anamnetic recovery requires not just the recovery of classical texts or constitutional forms, but the cultivation of the contemplative disciplines that make such texts and forms meaningful expressions of transcendent order. Without this spiritual foundation, even the greatest achievements of political wisdom become vulnerable to Gnostic corruption. Consider the current conservative movement's relationship to the American founding. Many conservatives memorize founding documents and celebrate founding principles, yet they often lack the contemplative discipline that enabled the founders to participate authentically in transcendent order. This produces what we might call constitutional fundamentalism, attachment to political forms without understanding of the spiritual experiences that animated their creation. Similarly, progressive movements often appeal to founding ideals like equality and justice, yet they typically interpret these ideals through Gnostic consciousness that seeks perfect realization through political action alone. They forget that authentic equality and justice emerge from souls ordered in relation to transcendent reality, not from the manipulation of social conditions. The historical pattern suggests that genuine political renewal requires individuals willing to undertake the difficult work of anamnetic recovery, the disciplined examination of consciousness and its relationship to transcendent order that enables authentic participation in political community. Chapter 5: The American Crisis of Consciousness. Contemporary America faces what I recognize as the most profound crisis of political consciousness in its history, a crisis that cannot be resolved through electoral politics or policy reforms but only through the recovery of anamnetic discipline among individual citizens willing to undertake the work of genuine spiritual and philosophical inquiry. The symptoms of this crisis manifest everywhere, yet they remain largely unrecognized because the consciousness that might diagnose them has itself been compromised. Americans experience profound alienation from their political institutions, yet they typically interpret this alienation in ideological terms that prevent genuine understanding. Progressives blame conservative resistance to change, conservatives blame progressive destruction of tradition. Both interpretations avoid confronting the deeper spiritual crisis that makes authentic political community impossible. Consider the current state of American political discourse. Public debate has devolved into what we might call ideological theater, the performance of political positions for tribal audiences rather than genuine inquiry into the common good. Politicians speak in focus group-tested language designed to manipulate rather than illuminate. Citizens consume political information that confirms their existing biases rather than challenging them toward deeper understanding. This degradation of political discourse reflects a more fundamental problem: the loss of what I call participatory consciousness, the capacity to recognize oneself as part of a reality that transcends individual desires and group interests. When consciousness operates primarily through ideological categories, it loses touch with those experiences of transcendent order that make genuine political community possible. The American founding was possible because figures like Washington, Jefferson, and Madison possessed participatory consciousness developed through extensive engagement with classical and Christian wisdom traditions. They could experience themselves as participants in a cosmic order that included both human community and divine reality. This consciousness enabled them to create institutions that served transcendent purposes rather than merely expressing temporal power. Contemporary Americans, by contrast, have been educated in forms of consciousness that systematically exclude transcendent participation. Modern education promotes what we might call technical consciousness, the ability to manipulate information and solve practical problems, while neglecting the contemplative disciplines that develop participatory awareness. Students learn to analyze political systems without developing the spiritual capacity necessary for authentic political participation. This educational amnesia creates citizens who are simultaneously overinformed and underwise. They possess vast amounts of political information yet lack the consciousness necessary to transform information into genuine political understanding. They can debate policy details yet cannot participate in the kind of fundamental inquiry that enables authentic political community. The crisis deepens because both major political movements in America promote forms of consciousness that prevent anamnetic recovery. Progressive movements encourage forms of critical consciousness that systematically delegitimize traditional sources of transcendent order while offering no genuine alternatives. Conservative movements often promote forms of defensive consciousness that cling to traditional forms without understanding their spiritual foundations. Neither approach cultivates the kind of open yet disciplined inquiry that enables genuine anamnetic recovery. Both operate through what we might call closed consciousness, commitment to predetermined conclusions that prevent authentic philosophical investigation. The path forward requires recognizing that America's political crisis reflects a deeper crisis of consciousness that can only be addressed through individual commitment to contemplative discipline and philosophical inquiry. Chapter 6: Recovering the Founding Experience. The recovery of authentic American political consciousness requires more than historical study or constitutional interpretation. It demands anamnetic participation in the foundational experiences that made the American experiment in ordered liberty possible. This means recovering not just what the founders thought, but how they thought, and more fundamentally, the contemplative disciplines that enabled their political wisdom. When we examine the intellectual formation of figures like Jefferson, Adams, and Madison, we discover men who had cultivated through extensive reading and reflection a deep familiarity with the great tradition of Western political wisdom. Jefferson's library contained not just contemporary political theory but extensive collections of classical philosophy, Christian theology, and historical analysis. Adams filled his margins with contemplative reflections that reveal a mind deeply engaged with fundamental questions about human nature and divine order. This intellectual formation enabled what we might call foundational anamnesis, the recovery of permanent insights about political order that transcended the immediate circumstances of 18th-century America. When the founders spoke of natural rights, they were not inventing new concepts but participating in a tradition of contemplative inquiry that extended back through Aquinas and Augustine to Aristotle and Plato. Their understanding of natural rights emerged from anamnetic recovery of those experiences of human dignity that reveal themselves to consciousness discipline through philosophical and spiritual inquiry. They recognized that authentic political order must acknowledge the transcendent source of human worth while creating institutions that protect and cultivate human flourishing within the constraints of temporal existence. Consider Jefferson's approach to the Declaration of Independence. Rather than constructing new political theory, he sought to articulate in accessible language those self-evident truths that emerge from disciplined reflection on human experience. The phrase, "all men are created equal," represents not a statement of empirical fact but an anamnetic recovery of the insight that human dignity derives from participation in transcendent reality rather than temporal circumstances. This foundational anamnesis enabled the creation of institutions that embodied what we might call transcendent realism, recognition that authentic political order must acknowledge both human limitations and human dignity. The separation of powers reflected their understanding that no human authority could claim absolute sovereignty. The Bill of Rights acknowledged that human dignity transcends governmental grant while recognizing the necessity of political protection for human flourishing. Yet this foundational experience has been largely forgotten by contemporary Americans, including many who claim to defend founding principles. Conservative movements often reduce founding insights to constitutional mechanics while losing touch with the contemplative disciplines that made those insights possible. They defend the forms of limited government while forgetting the experiences of transcendent order that made such limits meaningful. Progressive movements typically dismiss founding insights as products of their historical limitations while failing to recognize the permanent validity of experiences like human dignity and transcendent obligation. They promote expanded governmental power while losing touch with the very insights about human nature that reveal why such power requires constitutional limitation. The recovery of foundational anamnesis requires more than academic study of founding documents. It demands the cultivation of contemplative disciplines that enable contemporary consciousness to participate in the same experiences of transcendent order that guided the founders. This includes serious engagement with classical and Christian sources, disciplined reflection on the nature of human dignity and political obligation, and the development of what we might call constitutional consciousness, awareness of the spiritual foundations that make constitutional government possible. Such recovery proves essential because the American experiment in ordered liberty cannot be sustained through mere institutional mechanisms but requires citizens capable of the kind of anamnetic participation that enables authentic political community. Chapter 7: The Path of Spiritual Resistance. In our current crisis of political consciousness, the most essential form of resistance is not electoral or institutional but spiritual, the cultivation of anamnetic consciousness that enables authentic participation in transcendent order despite the surrounding amnesia. This spiritual resistance provides the foundation for all other forms of meaningful political action and offers the only genuine hope for American renewal. Spiritual resistance begins with what I call the discipline of philosophical honesty, the willingness to examine one's own consciousness without the protective barriers of ideology or conventional opinion. This proves particularly challenging in our current environment, where political identity has become so central to personal identity that questioning political beliefs feels like questioning existence itself. Yet authentic spiritual resistance requires precisely this willingness to let go of constructed political identities in order to recover genuine experiences of transcendent order. This does not mean abandoning all political commitments, but rather grounding those commitments in contemplative discipline rather than ideological certainty. The practice involves what classical philosophy called the care of the soul, systematic attention to the quality of one's consciousness and its relationship to truth. This includes examination of how political emotions arise and subside, how ideological thinking operates, and how genuine insights differ from mere opinion. Through such examination, consciousness gradually recovers its capacity for anamnetic participation in transcendent reality. Consider how you might begin this discipline in your own life. Start by observing the quality of your political emotions. When you feel anger at political opponents or enthusiasm for political movements, examine the consciousness that generates these emotions. Are they arising from genuine insights about justice and order, or from ideological conditioning and group loyalty? This simple practice begins to create the space necessary for authentic political reflection. Spiritual resistance also requires the cultivation of what we might call intellectual independence, the capacity to think through political questions without being determined by party lines or ideological systems. This proves difficult because contemporary political discourse operates through what I call systematic polarization, the organization of all political questions into binary oppositions that prevent genuine inquiry. The development of intellectual independence requires extensive engagement with sources that transcend contemporary political categories. Read classical political philosophy not to find ammunition for current debates but to cultivate consciousness capable of fundamental political inquiry. Study American founding documents not to support particular interpretations but to participate in the contemplative discipline that made their insights possible. This contemplative engagement creates what we might call islands of order, spaces of consciousness that maintain connection to transcendent reality despite surrounding disorder. Such islands prove essential because authentic political renewal cannot emerge from mass movements or institutional reforms but only from individuals who have recovered the capacity for genuine political wisdom. The spiritual resistance I advocate does not require withdrawal from political engagement but rather engagement from a different quality of consciousness. Citizens who have cultivated anamnetic discipline bring to political participation a capacity for genuine inquiry rather than ideological advocacy. They can distinguish between authentic statesmanship and political manipulation, between genuine reform and Gnostic revolution. Such citizens become what we might call contemplative patriots, individuals whose love of country emerges from understanding of the transcendent foundations that make authentic political community possible. Their patriotism transcends both progressive criticism and conservative defensiveness because it emerges from participation in the same experiences of transcendent order that guided the founders. The multiplication of such contemplative consciousness provides the only genuine foundation for American political renewal. Electoral victories and policy reforms may prove necessary, but they cannot create the spiritual foundation that makes authentic political community possible. Conclusion. The recovery of American political consciousness through anamnetic discipline represents neither a conservative return to past forms nor a progressive advance toward future perfection, but rather a timeless possibility available to any soul willing to undertake the contemplative work necessary for authentic political wisdom. This recovery begins with individual recognition that our political crisis reflects a deeper crisis of consciousness, the forgetting of those experiences of transcendent order that make genuine political community possible. No electoral victory or policy reform can address this fundamental spiritual problem. Only the patient cultivation of anamnetic discipline among individual citizens can create the foundation for authentic political renewal. The path proves demanding because it requires letting go of the ideological certainties that provide false comfort in our confused age. It demands the intellectual honesty to examine our own consciousness without protective barriers and the spiritual courage to orient ourselves toward transcendent reality rather than temporal power. Yet this path remains open because the experiences that ground authentic political order cannot be permanently destroyed. Human dignity, justice, and divine relationship remain available to consciousness discipline through genuine philosophical and spiritual inquiry. The founders' insights about ordered liberty remain valid because they emerged from participation in permanent aspects of human experience. Your own participation in this recovery begins with simple recognition. The political problems that trouble you most deeply cannot be solved through external action alone but require the internal work of consciousness ordering itself in relation to transcendent reality. This recognition opens the possibility for authentic political engagement that serves genuine common good rather than ideological fantasy. The future of American political order depends not on mass movements or institutional reforms but on the multiplication of individuals committed to this contemplative discipline and anamnetic recovery.